My name is David Trulio, and it is my privilege to serve as the President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And as historians, I think many of you will especially appreciate that on November 4th, 1991, when President Reagan opened this institution that bears his name, he said, "Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future." And it's been really tremendous over the last couple of days to be with you and to witness firsthand how all of you are living up to that mandate of serving as this dynamic intellectual forum. So for that, I'm super, super grateful. And it's in that context that I'd like to start off with some important words of thanks. So obviously, but it's worth really emphasizing to our participants and to our sponsors, you are the Age of Reagan Conference. So thank you to every single one of you for being here. I know it's not always easy to travel, and August and July have their complexities, but it really means a lot. And I do want to offer a very special thanks to a few people: Dr. Henry Now, Roger Zackheim, and Dr. Anthony Eames, and the entire Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute team. As you can appreciate, this is a tremendous team effort. There's a lot that you see. There's way, way, way more that you don't see. I see Alice Burns walking in. She's a great example of somebody who's been working tremendously. And then I'd like to really single out, where did Henry go? I know he was around here. There he is. Well, Henry, super special extra thanks for your brain power, for your insights, for the experience, for the energy. It is truly tremendous that you are such a key part of this. So again, on behalf of the whole Foundation Institute, thank you for everything you've done. So let's give a hand to Henry. And where did Anthony Eames go? I know he's right in front of me. Okay, great. Well, hiding in plain sight, literally. Well, Anthony, it really struck me 2 nights ago with you on stage with Doug Brinkley and seeing everybody. What an amazing embodiment of your vision, of your intellectual horsepower, of your hard work. If there's an indispensable man in all of this, it's Anthony Eames. So thank you. Okay, now it's time to present the Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize. And first, it's worth specifying what the award is and what it is not. It's always good to have some clarity. So the prize is an invitation to the academic community to dive even deeper into the history of Ronald Reagan's presidency and the archives here in Simi Valley. And much of what is in those archives is yet to be explored. The book prize is not an award for memoirs or hastily written tributes. We expect thorough research. We expect footnotes. Lots and lots and lots of footnotes. The book prize is for works that connect our understanding of the Reagan administration with the events of the modern day. The prize is not, however, for books from decades past. We seek books published within the past 5 years that set new standards for presidential scholarship. And ladies and gentlemen, there can be no question that each of our finalists set new standards. So Aaron Bateman for Weapons in Space, The Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative. James Wilson for America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nitze and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan. And Jennifer Burns for Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. So now, it is my distinct honor to formally announce that this year's Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize goes to the inimitable Jennifer Burns for Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. And she just so happens to be sitting right on the front row on the edge. Funny how that works. Well, but first, some words about Milton Friedman. So as Professor Burns so masterfully demonstrates, he was likely the most persuasive economic voice during the Reagan administration, despite his decision not to serve in a formal role, or perhaps because of that decision. Before leaving office, President Reagan presented Milton Friedman with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The citation that he read said, in part, More central to his work is its moral component, the idea of human freedom in which man's economic rights are as vital as his civil and human rights. It is for his celebration of the human spirit as well as the brilliance of his mind that I bestow upon Milton Friedman the Presidential Medal of Freedom. After leaving office, President Reagan, who called Milton Friedman a friend, said this about the television adaptation of Friedman's works, quote, "I don't think it's an exaggeration to call Milton Friedman's Free to Choose a survival kit for you, for our nation, and for freedom." In other words, to understand Ronald Reagan, it's enormously valuable to understand Milton Friedman. And to fully understand Milton Friedman, one must read this book. It is the first full biography of Friedman to employ archival sources. In it, Professor Burns provides context for his groundbreaking work, including on everything from the vital importance of the money supply to why dentists earn less money than doctors. One aspect that is particularly notable is Professor Burns's examination of the many women, often overlooked, who contributed to Milton Friedman's success. She explores these collaborations as well as his relationships, good and bad, with the Washington power players of his era. Because of Professor Burns, we understand Milton Friedman better than we ever have. And because of that, we can understand Ronald Reagan and the policies that affect us to this day better than we ever have. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in honoring the scholarship and the contributions of Associate Professor of History at Stanford University and Research Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, Jennifer Burns. Congratulations. And then we're going to get right there, and we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Whoops, it happened again.
Thank you so much, David, for those kind remarks. Thank you to the Reagan Foundation staff for putting on this really stimulating conference, and I think what we can all agree is one of the most amazing conference venues we've ever been to. And I'm really pleased also that so many of you have stayed here for the last moment of the conference and for this prize ceremony. I really appreciate it. So I'm pleased that my book met the Reagan Foundation Prize mandate to, quote, connect our understanding of Ronald Reagan to the concerns of the present day. But I'm also really pleased it met that more informal requirement for footnotes, and more footnotes. So as you'll see if you get your copy of the book later, there are plenty of footnotes there. I spent 10 years researching this book. Hiding out, saying no to almost all invitations, passing up the opportunity to move to a beach during COVID because I could not leave behind the 256 books I had checked out from the library that I needed in order to complete this research. So as I was preparing these remarks, I realized that coincidentally, yesterday would have been Milton Friedman's 113th birthday. He was considered Reagan his favorite president, and Reagan in turn considered Friedman his favorite economist. So I think they would both have been very pleased by this honor, although I'm not sure that Friedman would have been pleased about everything I wrote about him. So I've been asked to talk about a couple of different things in these remarks. The state of the field, the intervention I intended my book to make, and the promising opportunities I see ahead for scholarship. So to start with the state of the field, I think it's clearly rich and exciting, and the conference attests to this. We have new resources, new archives, new interests, and new scholars all here, busy at work. But what is the field? There's a couple ways I think we could conceptualize this field. We could call it modern America. We could call it post-war America. We could call it the Age of Reagan. We would then hit the question, well, where does the Age of Reagan start? And I know that the inaugural prize winner, Will Imboden, urged scholars to go look at the early Reagan. And I think that a recent biography of Reagan by Max Boot does a pretty good job of really orienting us in the earliest personal experiences of Reagan. But there is still more to be done. And I think Reagan is a particularly interesting figure because he started kind of reading and coming to political consciousness in a movement that was outside the mainstream and that slowly came into the mainstream and then really reformulated the mainstream around him. And that really mirrored this larger political movement that he represents and is, a pattern that we see repeating in some ways even today. So, okay, we could then think of the field as the history of conservatism. And when I started my career, this was a slightly disreputable field. It was certainly neglected. I had the feeling as I was starting my research that I was in the attic, somebody's attic, and I was opening old boxes that had been put away long ago and they smelled kind of musty and I wasn't really sure what the contents would be. They had weird names. Who is Ludwig von Mises? I would wonder. What is the Economic Council of New York? What is this pamphlet, or is it a magazine? Human Events. But now it feels like the history of conservatism is a trendy new nightclub. I better buy a new outfit and psych myself up for the velvet rope. But I think in reality, we're at the point of synthesis and taking stock. To extend the metaphor, I'd urge us to collaborate on creating a beloved neighborhood restaurant where quality and nutritious food for the mind is served, where there's an eye on trends, but a real focus on fundamentals. And I think that taking a wide lens on political history, as this conference encouraged us to do, is one way to do that. Because I think when you use politics and national political events as a spine of your analysis, you end up hewing to events, to people, and to ideas that do matter in really fundamental ways. So about my intervention, there are many. It's a long book, but let me highlight three. One unintentional intervention that I ended up making with this book is to highlight the role of women in Friedman's life and career and thought. And this really is not just a add women, add water, and stir account. What I really emphasize is that intellectual cultures form in really distinct ways, influenced not only by the ideas people hold, but by their sociological location in the societies in which they are. And so what I found is that a really distinctive intellectual culture formed around professional women, highly educated women, who were shut out from professional economics, despite having economics trainings, degrees, or doing research. And what I also found was that Milton Friedman took advantage of that. It was not accidental that all of his major works featured a woman co-author, from his very technical work on the theory of the consumption function to his very popular work, the PBS series Free to Choose, and everything in between. And what I found was that Friedman's engagement with this distinctive intellectual culture that women economists had forged outside of the mainstream and below the notice of most professional economists, this was really what enabled him to zig while others zagged, and then to make really original contributions to the field as a whole. So that's one intervention I want to highlight. A second is an intervention around conservatism and the meaning of conservatism, and we discussed this to some degree in yesterday's panel. I've taken a lot of grief for calling Friedman a conservative, but I did so in the service of a larger point. Part of my nomenclature gestures to the way that Friedman, as an economist, focused to older fundamentals in economic thinking, from the quantity theory to the tradition of empirical research. But the larger point I really wanted to make is that American conservatism is distinctive because of thinkers like Friedman, and also because of thinkers like Ayn Rand, the subject of my first book. American conservatism incorporates a libertarian, free market, anti-government strain that, yes, as many commentators have pointed out, is often not, as it unfolds, particularly conservative. It might, in fact, partake of the creative destruction that Joseph Schumpeter said was at the core of capitalism. But it has been absolutely fundamental to the movement that calls itself conservative or conservatism in the United States. I will confess to having some wavering about the continued relevance of, let's say, libertarianism or Friedman-style economic analysis or social analysis with the dawn of the new right, the emergence of the MAGA movement. But the opening months of the Trump administration, particularly the centrality of DOGE, convinced me that this strain is not dead. It may have mutated, it may have combined with others, but it is still a very fundamental part of what makes American conservatism distinct, different, and I would also argue an ongoing powerful force. So this book was also an intervention into neoliberalism. And in the beginning, my question about neoliberalism was simple. What the hell is it? And we were still in the era of concept histories and explainers when I first began this research. And over time, though, the nearly decade that I worked, the term, the concept, the use of neoliberalism, it sort of went from trendy nightclub to classic restaurant, and there were some really foundational works, like Gary Gersol's work, Dan Rogers' work on the Age of Fracture, that really gave us more insight into what American historians meant when they dared to use this more theoretical term. And so I believe my own work really complements these insights by showing how Friedman's ideas, which you can call neoliberal if you like, are not just important to conservatives, but shaped the broader landscape. And I want to emphasize two pieces of this, of how his ideas transcended their kind of origin point within the conservative movement. First, my book talks about how Friedman turned what he called Chicago price theory, which we might understand as microeconomics, into a policy tool. We could think of Friedman as doing Freakonomics before there was Freakonomics. In other words, extending economic analysis to new domains. And this really went against the grain of public policy in his era, which was really focused on the state and looking to the state. And Friedman convinced us, in many cases, to look to the market first. And so there's a list of policies that Friedman pioneered, from the negative income tax to floating international exchange rates to school vouchers, that you can really all boil down to this: using prices and the price system as a mechanism of policy rather than as the target of policy. So if during the New Deal era and after, a lot of goal of policy was to fix prices or manipulate them or lower them, Friedman has a completely different approach, was to use price itself as the policy. And in some ways, this now seems natural to us. This is a part of the policy toolkit that we have. But it was not at the time. And my book emphasizes the sort of long journey of this idea and the ways that Friedman's own reputation suffered for advocating it, and the ways in which he eventually helped push this into public discussion and into policy work itself. Secondly, in my book, I emphasize the centrality of what we could call the Keynesian monetarist debate to intellectual life in the United States in the 1960s and through the 1980s. And it really started with Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman's analysis of the Great Depression. And they offered a monetary analysis of the Great Depression that put the Federal Reserve at the center of the action, or rather the inaction, as they famously argued that the Fed had not been attentive to its role in forestalling the economic crisis. And this really has become the playbook of economic policy ever since. Officials of the Federal Reserve do not want to be in Friedman and Schwartz part two or of their own time. And so you see anytime there is an economic crisis, from COVID to the great financial crisis, a real understanding that the Fed has to do something. We may disagree with what it does, but there is no longer a sense that the Fed is not important. And that really comes out of that profound historical analysis, which at its time was a new departure, and today really has seeded lines of research that continue. So Friedman and Schwartz create this really fundamental interpretation or reinterpretation of the Great Depression. Now then this grows into a larger school of thought that Friedman eventually accepted the term monetarism to designate. And this was one that centered on monetary policy and the Federal Reserve and really placed a new institution, the Federal Reserve, at the center of economic debate and our understanding. And this was a transformation that stuck. And again, it's a hard transformation maybe for us to grasp. We now live in a world where every utterance of the Fed chair is parsed and makes headlines. In Friedman's day, it was a much more veiled and hidden institution. There was much less transparency. There was much less understanding of the fundamental role it played. And through Friedman's work and over the course of his career, that really shifted and changed. And so as I talk about in the book, Friedman's ideas and their spread was not just about the United States. It was really worldwide, from the UK to Chile to China. His ideas became broadly influential and important. And in this way, Friedman was reminiscent of Ronald Reagan in terms of his capacity to reorganize the intellectual landscape. Just as Ronald Reagan reordered the political landscape in the United States, also the geopolitical landscape in the world. So a third and final intervention of my book is I would say metacognitive or methodological, and this is to say to my fellow historians, don't be afraid of the history of economics. Don't be afraid of economics. Engaging with it will enable you to think more rigorously, to question your own assumptions and your priors, and to maybe slow your common assumption that neoliberalism is justifiably an intellectual swear word, as one wag had it. For example, I wonder how many historians of modern America have heard of the Great Moderation. I certainly wasn't familiar with that term when I began this research. But it's what economists call the period from 1982 to 2007, the longest period of peacetime economic expansion since World War II, a period in time in which there were no recessions, depressions, or shocks, those great and undiscriminating destroyers of wealth and prosperity for all. But that's probably not the story of the 1980s you got in history class or from history books. I at least got one about economic inequality and injustice. So how does that fit, or does it even fit with this idea of the Great Moderation? And wait, what is the story of the Great Moderation? At the risk of boring you all, it has to do with monetary policy. And Friedman's ideas about the root of inflation and the new economic consensus growing out of his work and also out of the experience of the 1970s, that inflation was not harmless, that inflation exacted a real cost economically and politically. And as I've argued, this is a lesson we've had to relearn just this past year. Inflation was a huge driver of political support for President Trump. If we hadn't been so cavalier about neoliberalism and its successes, so eager to get to post-neoliberalism, we might not have ended up where we are with post-liberalism. So the Great Moderation happened because of Paul Volcker's willingness to fight inflation and Ronald Reagan's ability to power through a period of political unpopularity, and to Ronald Reagan's grasp of economic fundamentals. Now, we can argue about some of these, were they always followed, in questions of fiscal policy or national debt, but when it came to inflation, they were. And people ask me sometimes, what was Friedman's greatest point of influence? One is the Nixon administration through his friendship with George Shultz that really helped him profoundly shape the end of Bretton Woods and the post-Bretton Woods order that emerged afterwards. This international order of free trade or freer trade and relatively open borders that held until very recently. The second point, though, of Friedman's greatest influence is through his relationship with Ronald Reagan. And he really kept Reagan steady in the fight against inflation. As Volcker tightened monetary policy and raised interest rates in the service of defeating inflation, there were many factions within the Reagan administration who wanted the president to demote Volcker, to criticize him publicly, to put him in his place, to rein in the Fed, to pull back on its independent monetary policy and do a sort of policy that was more responsive to the political moment. But another faction supported Volcker's moves, and they were bolstered in this support by Reagan's favorite economist, as was Reagan himself. Friedman told him when he came into office, you have to tackle inflation now. You have to do it early. You have to stay the course. It will be painful, but ultimately you will reap the benefit. So back to the Great Moderation. From 1982 until 2007, well, what happened then? You might know what happened. It was deregulation and the chicanery of greedy bankers. But what if I said instead it was actually all about interest rates? Would you even know what I was talking about? Or simply tell me that I was wrong? Hopefully you wouldn't go ad hominem and tell me I don't care about inequality, poor people, or that I love bankers, or that I'm hard-hearted. But how would you engage me on the merits of this claim? Now, I know that perhaps the people listening here in this room would be ready to do that, but far too many historians wouldn't even know where to start with that argument. They might not even know that there is another narrative out there. We've taken the cultural turn so far, we've privileged interpretation over any robust debate over what actually happened. So it's possible as an American historian to be educated to a very deep level on all the political consequences of the Great Depression, but to have very little understanding of the debate over its causes, to actually not participate or even be aware of the debate over what those causes are. As one paper looking at history textbooks put it, there is, quote, a wide gulf between history textbooks' explanation and that of economists and economic historians that raises some troubling questions about the integration of knowledge between these two fields. Now, this isn't completely true. Historians like Eric Rauschway have been really tilling this field for years. Sebastian Edwards has written a lot about the ending of the gold standard in the 1930s. Historians may not have heard of him because he's an economist who writes history, but there's lots of others out there. So my plea to historians is please stop reading only other historians. Please read economists, read economic sociologists. I think when it comes to the 1980s, the economic sociologists absolutely put historians to shame in their grasp of what is happening structurally in the economy and how that's affecting politics and society. These aren't obscure citations, they're all in those aforementioned footnotes if you want to check them out. So in the end, my book is an invitation to engage in the history of economics, to engage with social scientists, and I really hope it feels like a field guide to new territory. People sometimes ask what training I have. They say, it seems like you got a PhD in economics. And I say, nope, I took 2 semesters of economics in college, like basic micro and macro. I'm not even sure that was necessary. I really don't know how much of that I remembered. But I think that perhaps it gave me the courage to tackle this topic. And I think courage is what we need most of all. So I want to leave the final intervention to be, don't be afraid. Strike out for new territory. Talk to people outside your field. Learn new things. Cultivate specialist knowledge and bring it back to synthesize with the broad historical consciousness and knowledge you already have. If I can do it, so can you, and I'll see you up here in the podium in a few more years. Thank you so much.
Well, that is an impossible act to follow, so I will barely even try. I will leave you with one invitation, though, before sending you over to the book signing booth, where Professor Burns will sign copies of Milton Friedman. And since we know he knew supply and demand all too well, there are only a limited number of books available, so it's limited supply, so please get up there quickly. But I want to you can bid. Dave, you'll start the bidding. I want to leave you, though, with an invitation. The Age of Reagan Conference, the scholarly initiatives that we support at the Reagan Foundation and Institute are made better by dialogue with all of you. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your proposals about how we can make 2027 even more successful than 2025. We want to hear from young scholars who are just finishing their PhDs about the exciting projects that deepen our understanding of the Age of Reagan for our postdoctoral fellowships. We want to hear about the ways we can work together with other history societies and economic societies, and yes, political scientists too, Henry. So please consider that invitation open at all times. And one last final thank you to our staff, to Dave, to Roger, to Henry, and a special shout out to Maggie McKinney, who you've all interacted with. I'm sure none of you would have found the shuttles without her. And she'll help you find the shuttles after this book signing as well. So thank you.